Hey everybody. So this week I talked to Nico Slate again. He's the professor at Carnegie Mellon, and he just published and came out with a book called Brothers, which is just such a beautiful book. And I had such an immersive experience reading it. And then I was like, oh, I have the good fortune to know the author. So I had him on the show to talk a little bit about his book and about the subjects of the book, which are loosely, brotherhood and race relations, because it's about his relationship with his half brother. And we had this beautiful conversation, which I'm excited to share with you. And it was really thought provoking for me. And I'm taking an assignment from it, which is to get interested, and you'll hear in the episode, but to ask questions and just get a little, Ken Cloak would say, get a little bit dangerous with my questions and my beliefs. And I'm going to try and do that sometime in the next couple weeks and get back to you. So here's Nico. So the main message I want to come out of today's episode is just that everybody who's listening to this should read your book. That's all. And so this episode could just be 2 minutes. But that's the takeaway. The book is called Brothers. It's by my friend Nico Slate, and it's just phenomenal. So that's, and as long as we need to talk about that, fine. But that's really the point. And for me, it was so, I mean, many parts of it were so incredibly powerful. But as an only child,
Mm.
I really got a glimpse, like a visceral
Mm.
understanding through all of these vignettes and these little stories you tell about you and your brother, but what it's like to have a brother.
Mm.
And it was so it was really beautiful and heartfelt. And this weekend, I was mentioning I had a bunch of people over for a kind of meditation retreat, and there's this guy. His name is Anai, Gujarati guy, Gujarati
Mm.
American. His last name is Shah.
Mm.
And I was just doing, I almost had this kind of like this like vision or fantasy during the weekend. I was like, what if I grew up with this guy?
Mm.
What if this
Wow.
guy was my older brother or younger
Wow.
brother?
Wow.
And it was really informed by your book.
Mm.
And it felt, and I felt at the same time this joy of imagining it, but also just the longing.
That's beautiful, Ankur. That means a lot to me. And I had never seen it this way before, but hearing you speak makes me realize that part of what I really hope the book can do is inspire people to reach out and try to build new forms of brotherhood, sisterhood, fraternal connection, and love in this world. And I think it doesn't have to be about blood relationship. Many people are blessed to have amazing siblings that they love and hold dear. Others, like me, have amazing siblings that they lose and grieve and have to miss for the rest of their lives. And then there are people that either grew up as single children or maybe grew up with siblings that they just didn't get along with, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it doesn't always happen that one is as close to one sibling as I happen to be with my brother. That's just how life is. But regardless of the situation, I think ours is a world that needs more love of that kind, love between people who are connected as brothers or sisters or siblings of one kind or another. So it means a lot to me to hear that the book left you feeling some sense of what that can be and gave you some reasons to imagine having those sorts of connections with others in the world. That's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wonder, because friendship is a huge part of my life.
Mm.
Like we went to school together, and
Mm.
a lot of those people, probably like 15
Mm.
people that I went to college with are just incredibly present in my life.
Mm.
I was like a part-time roommate who spent
Mm.
40% of the last 7 years living in my home, and
Mm.
just bought land and built a house like a few miles away. He's not from here or anything. And it was just like, wow. We looked back at these pictures of when Jasmine was just born, and he's there, and it's just like, wow, her whole life has been her uncle. And
Yeah.
it's so, God, it's so beautiful. But what's the difference? Like, is there a difference between these people that I live with now? We have a close relationship for 20 years, and
Sure.
your brother.
That's a beautiful question. I think there is absolutely a difference growing up with someone creates certain kind of connectedness, a certain sort of relationship. It can also, in many cases, probably in all cases, create a whole lot of baggage. I would imagine that the family of choice that one can create over time, and I think you've done a marvelous job of creating a family through the friendships that you've cultivated, right, in college, post college. Those families can be just as deep and real and meaningful, I think, as people one grew up with. But I think there is a difference. And in my case, and part of what the book I think explores is how when you grow up with someone and live lives that are so closely connected and yet also inevitably different, right? And in my case, there's the somewhat unusual fact that my brother's father was from Nigeria and mine was a white American guy. My mom raised us as a single mom. And so race was a giant invisible wall in my family. And I say invisible because, as you know, it wasn't something that we grappled with much at all within our family. We talked a lot about race and racism in the world beyond. We were politically engaged in that way, but I don't remember ever having a conversation with my brother about how and in what ways race divided us, even though he was a black man and I was a white man. And race did divide us. And part of the book for me was grappling with how it divided us, why I didn't ask those questions earlier, even after my brother was attacked in 1994, the attack that the book begins with, that episode that I understood at the time as a blatant example of white supremacist violence. And I still continue to feel, even though the situation's become much more complicated, the more I learned about it, I still feel that race played a strong role that night that he was attacked. Even that incident didn't inspire me to really think much at all about the role that race played between us, among us as brothers. And that was my own blindness, I think. And it was our love. And it was the way that our love worked to transcend those lines, even when they were still there, right? It didn't transcend them perfectly or entirely, but enough such that we didn't actively engage them. So what does that mean for people living in the world? I think it means that all of us, in our romantic relationships and our friendships, those of us who are parents in connecting to our children, I feel like there's always a strange amalgam of closeness and distance that is important to recognize. For me as a father, one of the things I'm actually actively trying to do, Ankur, is to remind myself that my children are different than me, that they're own unique, independent people. And I have to respect that and recognize that sometimes when my daughter doesn't want to eat breakfast or put on her clothes in the morning, it's because she is who she is. She's not a morning person. She's expressing her own individual uniqueness. And the more I can respect that, the more we can find a way to live together and learn to love each other. So in the case of my brother, I wish that he and I had done more to I wish I had done more to actively grapple with our differences, because I think it would have been a chance for us to grow even closer. So just to pull the circle around, I'd say, for you and the amazing friends slash family that you've cultivated over time, and you do that as well as anyone I know. You're one of the best at this, and I really admire it and marvel at it. I think it might seem less important to grapple with differences, because when you formed those relationships, you weren't forming them from a place of seeming uniformity. You weren't stuck together, right, as a family growing up. So the differences were already there and present. But I think that over time, friends change and shift, and their lives change and shift. And so I think part of the magic of what you've achieved, Encore, is that you've been able to maintain these relationships with people over time, even as you've changed and even as they've changed. And I'm sure that part of the way you've done that is by being mindful of those changes and those differences and finding ways to respect them. So ultimately, for me, that's what the book is about, is finding ways to love across difference, not by ignoring it, recognizing it, in our case, racial difference, but also other kinds of difference. My brother was an entertainer, a screenwriter, a musician. I was a boring student. And yet we still loved each other and we were there
Yeah.
for each other and we cared
Yeah.
for each other. And that's part of, I think, the magic of love in our world, is that it operates across those differences, not by erasing them.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. This is hitting on a lot of themes for me, and I don't know if I'm gonna pull it together, but I'm gonna try. So one is your story with your brother. Another is how discussions of race as one category of difference, or maybe difference in general, have evolved in our society from, I'm thinking of the 40s to right now,
Mm,
because I'm thinking
mm,
of a book by Richard Powers.
mm,
And the third is just contemporary political rancor,
mm.
visions, and what we can learn about our divided communities. So the way I
Yeah.
want to draw all that together is that there's an attitude or a stage in development or thinking that it doesn't matter. Like, I love you, you love me, we're brothers.
Mm,
Why do we need to talk about that?
mm.
And I don't know if you read In the Time of Our Singing by Richard Powers.
No, but I think you told me about it. I
God,
need to
it's
read
so beautiful.
it.
So everybody who's listening, read Nico's book. It's amazing. And then read this book by Richard Powers. The one by Richard Powers is a bit longer. It'll take you more time. Um, but they're both beautiful books, and I see them as very connected.
Mm,
And in this novel, which I think he must have written a long time ago, but it's the story of a family from the 40s until like the early 2000s.
mm,
And it's an interracial family. The father is a German Jew physicist exiled to New York, some kind of like Einstein type analog.
mm,
And then the mother is a Black American from Philadelphia who's really into gospel singing, but they're both really into music.
mm,
And they get married, they have kids, and they're part of this phase in American history of like the colorblind kind of thing.
mhm.
But
Yep,
they're really early on.
yep,
It's the 40s. They're still writing the name, the color of the child is on the birth certificate. So
mm,
you got to say
wow,
black or white. There's segregation. It's like the kids have to go to a black school or a white
yeah,
school,
yeah.
and they're like, so your kid's black or white? And they're like, we don't believe in that. And it's beautiful. Like the way they talk about it, I'm like,
Sure.
yeah, that's totally what I would have done.
Yeah,
And their kids are totally fucked up
yeah,
because the kids needed some kind of identification. And
sure,
the parents
sure.
just did not ever talk about it.
Yeah,
And this super oppressive, racialized, like categorical society that they didn't fit into any category. And
yeah.
they just felt abandoned.
Wow.
And it was like such a lesson for me because I would have done exactly what those parents did. And I was like, oh, there's a better way.
Yeah,
And so
yeah,
now we're at that in our culture in a way that like, okay, we got to talk about race. But
yeah,
the way most people talk about it is just incredibly, to me, I feel like it's like too divisive.
yeah.
It's
I
like
hear you.
really over prioritizing it in a
Right,
sense.
right,
And
right.
so like when you think about I think about your brother, and it's like, all right, what are the ways? It's like the elephant in the room in a way. Like, what are the ways that you could have? And you're both, your mom is like, in the book at least, she's like super progressive, social justice.
Yeah,
She's not denying,
no,
racism in society or anything.
no.
So that's clearly at your dinner table in terms of a conversation,
Yeah,
political conversation.
yeah,
But in what way could you bring that? Could you have brought that into the relationship
yeah,
that would not replace it or like put aside the unconditional love, but
yeah,
really like use it to grow the relationship stronger?
yeah. I think the main thing I wish I had done more often is just ask my brother questions about his own identity as a mixed race Black man, his own experience of navigating the weird divisions and peculiar uh it's not just about divisions, it's also the sort of peculiar topography, if you will, of race in our society, the way that there are places where you can reach a sort of a hilltop where kind of race falls away and it can seem like everyone is coming together across those lines and it matters less, and then you descend sort of into this valley where all of a sudden everyone is divided and you're constantly moving between different realms, and it's not always clear what one will be or the other. For my brother's case, for example, I do know that he often felt, um, I want to say as uncomfortable, but he often felt uncomfortable in spaces that were all black in a different way than how he felt in spaces that were all white.
Mm.
Because of the way he looked, most people on the street in our society would easily peg him as black. But if he's in an all black space, then he's going to be one of the lighter skinned people in that space. His hair will be a little bit different. And so he had to navigate never entirely fitting in any of those spaces. And I mentioned this briefly in the book, but I think that's part of why the friend cohort that he sets up is one that's mostly people who are second generation immigrants from countries or places in the world that don't map easily onto our own racial hierarchy. People
Hmm.
from Egypt or Iran, Morocco, etc. And I think that allowed him to find a home, a kind of across the color line rather than in any one camp or the other. And in his hip hop world, of course, he ends up really getting connected to hip hop groups that don't line up naturally or easily, right? Like Cypress Hill.
So
Um,
Cypress Hill was one of the first interracial hip hop groups. Is that
I'd say one of the first ones that became really famous, right?
okay? Yeah.
Yeah, that became well known. And it's no surprise that that's the group that he gravitates toward. Um, but I like the way you frame this sort of trajectory for our society from a place where um, people who were generally on the left of the political spectrum were envisioning a world beyond race, right? The sort of colorblind era, to a time when now the key thing is to recognize race and talk about race and examine it, but perhaps too much, perhaps at the expense of recognizing other forms of identity or other forms of connectedness. And I guess my own hope is that we can find a healthy middle ground there, rather than swinging back and forth between one pole or the
Yeah.
other. And
Yeah.
of course, there are still a lot of people in our society that don't want to talk about race at all, right? You have books being banned because they deal with race. You have professors being told they can't talk about it or teach it. So, high school teachers being told they can't talk about it or teach it. So that's a mistake. We need to examine it because it's who we have long been and it's still who we are as a society. Race is still absolutely central to so many facets of our world. Everything from our segregated cities and schools to our segregated life expectancies and health outcomes, right? I mean, it's everywhere in our society. So we have to examine it and talk about it, think about it. But we shouldn't, I don't think, get stuck there, right? When we're interacting with each other as human beings, we shouldn't get stuck with race. We should be able to move beyond it and through it and with it. And when we're imagining a future, what I've come to hope for, for my children's generation, for your children's generation, for the next generation, is a world in which people are able to embrace the positive aspects of certain racial identities that have long been connected to freedom struggles and emancipation. So, for my brother as a Black man, there was a lot of hope and meaning in embracing his identity as a Black man. And I wouldn't want to try to even envision a society that was entirely beyond those histories, because there's a lot of positive there. But to get to a place where race is not constraining anymore and not limiting, and a place where our society isn't so unequal and structured around those sorts of racial hierarchies. Again, whether you're talking about where people live, the jobs they have access to, the schools they have access to, right? Policing. There's just a lot we have to grapple with still. So how do we do that? How do we think about race, talk about it, grapple with it, fight racism in all its forms, while also recognizing that we're human beings and remarkably quirky, rich, variegated, fascinating human beings, right?
Yeah.
And
But
maybe that's where
your
love comes back in,
prescription
right? Yeah,
your prescription makes so much sense, which is just like what you would do with your brother, is just have asked more questions about his
yeah,
experience.
yeah, yeah. And I don't know, Ankur. I mean, I still don't know. Some of it is, of course, I was young, right? And then by the time that I was old enough to start really thinking about these things, he had gone off to college, then I went off to college, and race wasn't a major part of my consciousness in those days, in part because I was white guy growing up in the late 90s, I had a certain kind of racial blindness that limited my awareness of what my brother's experience had been and was. I think that was certainly some of it. Um, but I think some of it was also a fundamental um, a lack of real empathy across our lines as brothers. And I don't um I don't feel like my brother would want me to get stuck in guilt.
Yeah.
That I don't think that's what he would want. His love was so deep and strong for me. But I do feel the need to reckon with that absence of empathy, and to think again about, well, how can I make amends even though my brother's no longer with us? What can I do moving forward to try to not be blind again, and to recognize when I'm being limited by my own experience, right? And
Yeah.
not trying to think about the way others have experienced the world.
I'm gonna make I'm gonna challenge that, and I'm gonna make a different assumption. Like, let's just say, because this happened a long time ago,
Mm,
and I don't, certainly if it were my life, I wouldn't remember what actually happened. So I think
mm,
I'm going to project the same onto you. But let's say that like adolescent Nico in the mid 90s,
mm,
we just had like the whole Rodney King thing, 92.
yeah,
And it's not like it's not on our minds at that
yeah,
time, growing up in the
yeah,
90s and listening to like hip hop about the
yeah,
police and segregation and the
yeah,
riots and all this
yeah,
shit. So let's say it was on your mind and you did have
yeah,
empathy. And because I'm just imagining many people in this situation right now,
yeah.
there are good reasons why we're not asking those questions.
Mm. Is it fear of putting someone on the spot or making something
Yeah,
awkward?
I think
Yeah,
I think I think that, but also like fear of judgment, like
yeah.
fear of saying the wrong thing.
Fear of saying the wrong thing. Yeah,
I mean, there's lots of good reasons why you see someone who has a different. Well, in your case, it's your brother, but
yeah.
sometimes it's just like in the store, And like I
Mm.
remember going to Idaho to visit my girlfriend in college, and this like mom and her kid running up to me, and the kid was touching me. And the
Oh,
mom was so embarrassed and was like, "Oh, you're the first black person, not that I'm black, but whatever." Put that aside, that my kid has seen.
yeah,
Um, and it's just like it can be really sensitive and
yeah. Oh, yeah,
embarrassing, and it's
yeah.
easy to do the wrong thing or say the wrong thing when
Sure,
faced with difference.
sure, sure. Oh, yeah. No, I agree with you. Although I don't know. I think in my case, I spent so much time with my brother engaging issues of race in the world, as you said, talking about Rodney King. I remember this shows up, I think, briefly in the book, but sitting on the couch watching Arrested Development's Tennessee video, and talking to him about that. We talked about it a lot. And I think in my case, it was more a kind of um, starry-eyed ignorance, just not thinking about, well, what has his experience really been like? Well, what has it meant to him to be a black man in America, and what does it mean to us? I think that was more the issue than this sort of worry about saying the wrong thing. But I agree with you. I think many people right now, especially white people, but not only white people, are hesitant to talk about race because they do worry about saying the wrong thing. And look, that there's I think there's a mixed story there, because on the one hand, of course, I hope that we can have more honest conversations across racial lines. And I think those conversations are really urgent and necessary. But it doesn't mean that people should feel like, well, I'm just going to say whatever I want or ask whatever question, whatever I want, whenever I want. I think it's good to be aware and sensitive, and to think about what's the right context, what's the right situation, for me to have that kind of interaction or conversation with someone, because these questions are sensitive and they are difficult, right? And so, in the classroom, for example, uh, I've seen many times people ask well-meaning questions that are, trying to start but they're done in a way that puts someone on the spot in a situation where it's just not productive. So I
All
think
right. Can we
again,
go to
trying to find
an
a middle ground
example
there, you know?
to make this clear? I love a bad example, and then like how we can fix it.
Let me give you one from my historical research because it's fresh in my mind. Um, as you know, I've been studying the Highlander Folk School, which is this amazing radical institution that was in the hills of Tennessee. It's still in the hills of Tennessee, actually, still going strong. That played a vital role in the civil rights movement. Every major civil rights activist came to Highlander. And one of the amazing things Highlander did is that they recorded many of their workshops, first audio tapes, later videotapes. So I have this wonderful treasure trove of tapes, and I've been watching these audio tapes from the 1980s. There's a workshop in 1982 that brought together about 60 activists across the racial lines, mostly Black and white folks, although some other folks that don't fit in either of those two camps. And they're talking about everything, and there's a lot of honesty there, and it's fraught, and sometimes people just stick their foot in their mouths. And one point, a well-meaning white woman, she's an environmental activist from rural Virginia, raised her hand and directs a question to the people of color in the room, and she says, they've been talking about the resurgence of racism in the early 80s, the return of the Ku Klux Klan and violent white supremacy and other forms of racism. And she raises her hand and she says, I just want to ask the Black folks in the room, you know, I'm white, I'm from rural Virginia. There aren't a lot of Black people in my community. I don't really think that much about race or racism. But I want to ask the Black people in the room, have you all formed good connections or ties with Asian Americans, with Latinos, Chicanos, with Native Americans, and others? And this is a well-meaning question about transracial solidarities among people of color. But the fact that she prefaces it by saying, I'm white and I live in a rural area, there aren't a lot of people of color, so I don't know much about it,
Mm-hmm.
comes across as if she's saying, and I have no need to know about it, or I shouldn't know about it. It comes across as a kind of a giving herself an excuse for not knowing more or not being more involved. And I don't think that's what she meant it to be, but it comes across that way as if she was saying, white people don't need to be involved, so you people of color should get together to try to figure this issue out, right?
And it
And
comes across to you that way, or it came across to them,
it
or
came
both?
across to them,
Them.
the people of color in the audience, who then very voracious, sort of vociferously, vehemently challenged that presumption and
Oh.
basically took this woman to task and said, you're presuming that it's not your responsibility, but actually it is the responsibility of white people, even if they live in a rural area, even if they don't have a lot of people of color in the area. It's everyone's responsibility, but especially in many ways, white people's responsibility to learn more about racism and to take action to fight against it. And to her credit, this the white American woman was receptive. She listened, although there was some tension at first. Bernice Johnson Reagan, who's a famous civil rights activist and singer, she founded the wonderful a cappella group Sweet Honey in the Rock.
Mm.
She's leading the conversation. She does this marvelous job, something you're quite good at, Ankur, actually. She does this marvelous job of helping people connect as human beings across these differences. She
Yeah.
uses some humor to try to leaven the conversation a bit, and does a marvelous job of it. And it ends up, I think, being a positive conversation. And they do actually eventually come back to the question that the white woman posed and talk about that. But first, they have to just address okay, wait a minute. It sounds like as a white person, you're giving yourself an out, right? And that's a tricky thing, because I actually think what she was trying to do in part was be humble, right? To say, I
Yeah.
don't know a lot about this, right? This isn't
Totally.
something I've experienced so much. But I think in our current political climate, it's good to lead. If you're going to lead with, I don't know much about this, also lead with something like, and I want to know more.
Mm.
I feel it's my responsibility to know more. I'm not trying to exempt myself from my own responsibility to understand what's happening in our world and what I can do to fight against racism or other forms of inequity in our society. So that's one example. And I don't know, I think the whole issue of microaggressions, you mentioned the kid coming up and touching you, right? I mean, this is sadly, the classic examples of white people asking people of color about their hair or this sort of thing, or asking people who are second, third, fourth, fifth generation Asian American, where are you from? As if the presumption, well, you must be from
Yeah.
India or you must be
Yeah.
from,
I get
right?
that a
That
lot.
kind of thing,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not an overt act of white supremacy, but there are racial and racist ideas built into that question, right? About who is an American, who belongs here.
Yes. Yes, certainly. And I often take umbrage at that. I really don't like that sometimes. And um I'm concerned that what you're saying is going to lead listeners who, let's say this fictitious listener that wants to engage across differences and has curiosity and wants to
Yeah,
build bonds, but is like
yeah,
a little afraid of what to say.
yeah,
I feel like if I were in that position, which I am sometimes,
yeah, yeah,
everything you just said would make me not want to say anything.
yeah,
It's like, oh fuck, this is a minefield.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that's not the effect either of us want to have, right?
No, it's not. I guess, I mean, okay, so how do you move forward knowing that it can be a minefield? I mean, I think one way to do it is to try to form some relationships first with
Yeah.
people, right? So that you're not trying to have a difficult, honest conversation with a stranger in a strange context, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there are certain contexts where you can have those conversations with strangers. Let's imagine a church group or a school saying to people, hey, we're going to have a conversation about race and racism. So that the people who show up know, okay, that's what's on the agenda. And then to some degree, that's what's expected, is to have an honest conversation about it. Great. But if that's not the situation, then maybe it's best not to lead with that. Maybe it's best to get to know people first. You know what I mean?
Dude,
And
yes.
like
Yeah.
once you have that basic relationship, then you can be like, hey, Ankur, man, like, what was it like growing up as a South Asian American in like a rural, mostly white area? What was that like for you, right? That might not
Yeah.
be the first question I ask you. Now, I mean, those that know me well as you do, I have a bad tendency sometimes to lead with difficult questions,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. It's
with
it's
age,
actually something we really love about you.
well, I appreciate that. And I tried to hold on to it. I mean, with age, I have become more cautious and maybe more respectful in some ways. But I'm trying not to become boring, because I do think it can be fun early on in getting to know someone to say, hey, look, this might be an awkward question, but um, do you think you want to have kids someday?
Yeah.
Or like, do you believe in God? What do you think of God? Like that kind of thing, right? It can be fun to go there rather than
Yeah.
just get bogged down in like the little small talky
Oh,
stuff.
the weather and the
Or the
sports.
weather. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. No,
Yeah.
no, life is short. So it's good to
Yeah.
talk about those things. And I think, race is a very powerful force in our society. And it's good to talk to people about that. So I'm not saying you have to, wait a calendar year before asking your friend about race. No, it doesn't have to always wait. But I do think it's good just to be aware and sensitive so that when you do it, that it can be a tricky thing.
Yeah.
But then do it. No, I think you're right. I mean, I certainly don't want to prevent anyone from having those sorts of conversations, because we're not going to move forward as a society. People aren't going to have real lasting bonds with each other if they don't think about and talk about these things. And this is true for other issues too, right? I mean, I feel like there's a lot of sensitive issues in our society, questions of gender and sexuality, for example. People can be hesitant to talk about those things, right? Religion, what we've talked some about, like hallucinogenic substances, medicines, right? People can be hesitant to talk about these things, right? Especially if they're not sure how someone else is going to respond.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
You know,
Yeah. Yeah. So just to go back to the whole like
yeah,
my experience with like the Indian thing, like
yeah,
where
yeah,
are you from question. So,
yeah,
which I get offended by sometimes, but I do want to say, like the last couple times it happened to me, I was really, I was still like annoyed. I was walking through a theater and somebody was like, you like touched their cheek like this, like, oh, where are you from? Like a
wow,
white person,
wow, that's amazing. Yeah,
old dude, super
yeah,
old dude.
yeah, yeah,
And I think what's really good, and I didn't have time to talk to that person. I was like looking for my family, but
yeah,
I think what's really going on there, and this is just what I want to highlight in general in life, is
yeah,
a request for connection.
mm,
Like most people who
yeah,
are asking me that are, they have some They probably have some guess that I'm from India
Yeah.
because I look that way,
Yeah.
and they have some connection with India.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like maybe they've been there, maybe they like Indian food,
Yeah.
maybe peasants in Mexico, and I traveled around rural Mexico. They would always be like, they'd be like, oh, like you're from India. Tell me about the elephants.
Wow.
Because
Yeah.
they had seen some, a
Sure.
TV program about elephants,
Sure.
and
Sure.
it's just like, dude, can we connect about this? Like,
Yeah.
there's
Yeah. Yeah.
no one in my life I could talk to about these elephants.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can we
Yeah.
talk about it? And
Yeah.
there's a real beauty there. There's a
Sure.
real beauty in like this guy probably wants to tell me about how he went to India 40 years ago and oh the poverty's horrible and all this shit. And it's like he wants to share a story.
Sure. 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 Sure.
And
Well,
there are
you're a
like
good
better ways
man,
of doing
Ankur.
it.
Yeah. You're a good man for having patience when people want to connect in silly, awkward, or even insulting ways. And look, I mean, I think the more we can look past people's foibles when they're trying to connect, the better, right?
That's the
And
whole
no,
project
yeah,
here.
no,
That's like
no, I
what
agree
we're
with
doing.
you. I agree with you. I think trying to find the good in people and that motivates them. And I think there are many examples in which people are saying awkward or silly things, but from the right perspective. And I think trying to meet them from where their heart is, where they're coming from,
Yeah.
is very important. I agree with you. I agree
Yeah.
with you.
I actually just recorded an episode with this friend of mine named Dan Greening, who has a podcast called Mindful Agility. It's
Mm,
about mindfulness in some way. And it's on this thing, we call it the trigger translator. And
mm,
the idea is that like when I say something that triggers you, like the the I don't know if the right response is right. The potential response that would
mm,
increase connectivity, which we
mm,
can't expect everyone to do at all times, but would be awesome, is
mm,
to internally translate and not and go from what you said to what your heart was really requesting,
mm.
you know,
Yeah,
and then
yeah,
to be able to respond to your true
yeah,
need
yeah,
and not just like the bumpy, pitted version of what we actually say.
yeah, yeah. That's beautiful, man. And I'll tell you, my brother was a master at that kind of
Mm,
translation, if you will. I think I gave the example in the book of the him going door to door selling newspapers, and
yeah.
this old woman with like 1,000 different bird cages in her house, and my brother pitches the newspaper to her as a way to like keep the cages clean. This is just one small little anecdote that I remember from my youth. Now that was a commercial context, but my brother was always trying to connect with people, and trying to find ways to do it through silly little banter or jokes or smiles or laughter. And I think that people hunger for that. They hunger for that kind of connection because there's so many souls in our world that feel fundamentally alone. And our world can feel so overwhelming and scary. And having that sense of connection, especially when you need to do a little translation, right? Yeah, when someone is saying something that might be triggering. I like that idea. That's a source of good in our world. It's a source of good. And I hope that over time we can raise new generations that are able to make it even easier by not asking where you're from as if you're not from the US, but maybe saying, you know, your is your family from India, right? And tell me about it rather than leading with their own story, right?
Yes.
And I think
that's
there's a way
that's
to
like the
connect.
deeper that's the
Yeah,
deeper thing that regardless of like all of the superficial race stuff, if we engage with others that was more like tell me about it without just always staying our own story,
yeah,
that's oof, that's what I want.
yeah, yeah. Well, and it's an interesting question, Encore, right? Is what is it that makes so many people hesitate to do that? And I think that sometimes it's that sensitivity that you mentioned earlier. It's people feeling like, well, I don't want to pry, right?
Yeah.
But I think some of it is also just habitual self-centered narcissism that's fundamental to the human condition, right? I think part of seeking enlightenment, right, is trying to let go of our egos, trying to break free of that thing
Yeah.
that keeps pointing us back into ourselves, so that we can say, actually, ultimately, this doesn't have to be about me right now, right? Like this can be about someone else. And you know, when I started the book, my goal was to write a book about my brother, so that when people read it, they knew who he was as a human being. And in the process of writing, I realized that I had to bring myself into the story, because to not do that would be superficial, and the reader wouldn't actually know my brother if they couldn't know that they were learning about him through my very complicated and fractured lens. But I didn't want it to become about me, right? And I
Yeah.
hope that for readers, that they still leave it feeling like, ultimately, this is a book about a remarkable human being who's not with us anymore. And in that process, I mean, I think that's part of what literature can do for us, is to help us get outside of ourselves, right? And to really inhabit and live in the shoes of someone else in our world. And to the degree that we can get better at doing that, I think it makes us better human beings. Also just makes the world so much more fun,
Yeah.
right? Because it's just so much bigger. It's not just us trapped in our little bubble. It's all these
Yeah.
people having these amazing experiences that we can learn from.
Yeah. Yeah. The way I see it, and this is, informed by the time I spent in India as an adult
Mm,
studying Indian philosophy and meditation and all the other things. But there's a Sanskrit word, Atman,
mm, yeah.
which is it's often translated as ego
Mm,
or as the self.
yeah.
And I really like that connection, and that there's just there's always going to be ego, and
Yeah.
it's not like the ego is a bad thing. I think I remember, when I first got into spirituality and meditation in college in my early 20s, I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to fuck the ego, I'm going to get rid of the ego. But there's no escaping the self. Like here we
Yeah.
are, like walking around doing stuff, most of us. And
Yeah.
then, so there's Atma, and then there's Brahman, which
Yeah.
is, you could translate it as God or divinity. But the definition I love of Brahman is, it's a mathematical definition, really. It is the one without a second.
Mm,
So it's just all inclusive. It's like the set that no element cannot be in that set.
yeah.
And the idea is to understand that, like, while we are Atman, like we're just our little confused dudes walking around, we are also Brahman.
Mm,
Because by definition, mathematically, we cannot
yeah.
not be in it.
Yeah.
And that's that expansion of perspective that we can get through psychedelics, we can get through religious experiences, we can get through getting lost in the woods for a couple days,
Yeah.
and we
Yeah.
can get through really understanding the experience of another person.
Mm. That's beautifully said, Ankur. That's beautifully said. I hope that all those listening have the chance to know you well, because you often do that for me. I think in two different ways, Ankur, and forgive me for embarrassing on your own podcast. Forgive me. But uh, some of it is just who you are. I feel like you, from the first time I met you, what now? 20 some years ago, more than
20,
that, 25,
26. Yeah.
26 years ago, right? You were seeking, you were searching, you were looking, and in that process, you were inspiring others to seek and search and learn. And there was a certain restless um, humility in that process that I found very contagious, and still do. But then there's also that deep love and empathy, right? That I find quite remarkable about you. I feel like there are a lot of I don't know, spiritual type people that go off and sit in a cave for 30 years, or climb a mountaintop, or disappear into a monastery. It can be a very solitary life, but I feel like you've chosen this, in some ways, harder path. One I aspire to in my own limited ways, but you've chosen a path of seeking enlightenment, seeking that Brahman, right? While still moving in a world of many others. and engaging them where they are and trying to help them forward in various ways, right? You were just talking about your home as a retreat center, right? I mean, that's a beautiful thing, to open your life to others in those ways, and still be able to follow your own path in the process, right? And I think that's certainly something I aspire to, although I feel often like sometimes I'm I don't know, too much of a shy recluse for my own good. I like to just spend time with my kids and sit with my writing and read my books. But I actually, my brother challenges me. He was so much more of an outgoing person than me. And a lot of the kinds of things I do, like working with high school kids, for example, who are into art and music, I think in the end of the day, I do that because it's my brother. It's a part of my brother in me still, that loved working with younger kids and helping open them up to forms of art and music. I always feel a little awkward doing it because I'm the least artistic, least musical person you can find. But then I think, nah, that's not what it's about. It's about sharing in the love of it.
Yeah.
Right. Anyway, I want to thank you, because I often am inspired both by your own personal path, but also by the way you're able to walk that path so open-hearted and so giving of others.
Thank you, Nico. Thank you. And thank you for being on the show. Again,
My pleasure.
the main point here, read this book. And here's my plan. I talk a lot about vision in my coaching work. The vision is that this book just changes the way people think about everything in this country, and it can do that. It's short, but it's about the self, it's about the relationships, it's about the brotherhood, it's got this whole race dimension. I think it has a lot of potential and power. In order to do that, it needs to be on this like New York Times bestseller list thing, so
I
people know
appreciate
about it.
that, man.
And I don't know how that happened. Like, this is my attempt to make that happen. So if anyone's listening to this and knows a better way of making that happen than just announcing it on my podcast, let me know, or let Nico know, because it's like, I don't have the chops. I don't have the capability to do that myself. Otherwise I would, Nico.
I appreciate that, Ankur. This conversation has meant a tremendous amount to me, and I'm very grateful for it.
Thank you. You're welcome. And thank you. And you're welcome. So we're new to YouTube, and we would love your feedback. Please comment, subscribe, follow, tell all your friends, and let us know what you think. Thanks. And remember, the only way out is through.